Carolina had always been a quiet and obedient girl. At school, she never allowed herself to argue with teachers or classmates. Despite talking little and spending most of her time with a book, the kids loved her and never teased her like other shy children. On the contrary, they often came to Carolina for advice, especially when it came to love. Carolina knew many stories from books and could give recommendations on any topic. The girl had a big family. Besides her, Carolina had 2 older brothers and a younger sister, whom she sometimes looked after. In the mornings, their mother braided their hair into long braids and asked the older brothers, who were twins, to take the sisters to school. Meanwhile, she spent the whole day cooking, washing, cleaning, and checking notebooks. Their mother worked from home as a private tutor. New children constantly came to them, whom their mother taught mathematics. One day, when Carolina came home from school, she saw a tall boy with a long thin neck in the hallway. He was wearing a plaid shirt with a bow tie and trousers, and his hair was neatly combed to one side. He looked at her intently and said, "You have such beautiful eyes." With these words, he took a notebook and left their house. Their mother entered the hallway. "Who was that?" asked the surprised Carolina. "My new student Alejandro," answered her mother, fixing the girl's hair. "A very capable boy. He had a passion for mathematics from an early age," his mother said. "It's evident he's already solving problems that are only covered in high school." Carolina was very surprised to hear this. "Is he a genius?" she asked. "Yes," her mother nodded. "There's a word for it, prodigy. It means that a person has outstanding abilities in some field from childhood." "Can he add large numbers in his head?" Carolina inquired. Her mother gently patted her on the head. "Why don't you ask him next time?" Carolina smiled and nodded. She eagerly awaited the next Tuesday when Alejandro was supposed to have a lesson with her mother. Finally, school was over, and one of her older brothers came to pick her up on his bicycle. "Can you go a little faster?" she asked when her brother was huffing and puffing up the hill. "Why don't you try yourself?" her brother grumbled. Carolina felt ashamed, but she was really afraid of missing Alejandro in the hallway. At last, they reached home, and Carolina ran down the path to the porch. Just then, the door opened, and Alejandro appeared on the threshold. He was again wearing a shirt, this time striped, a bow tie, and gray trousers with creases. Seeing Carolina, he smiled at her shyly. "Can you add large numbers in your head?" the girl blurted out, forgetting to greet him. Alejandro nodded. "I could do that in kindergarten," he laughed. Carolina stared at him in amazement. To her, it was a real miracle. The kids slowly walked down the path, and Carolina repeatedly asked Alejandro to add numbers, which he did with great pleasure. And so they became friends. Alejandro attended lessons with Carolina's mother for a whole year and managed to cover the entire school mathematics program during that time. Just before the holidays, he told Carolina that he would be leaving soon. "Where to?" the girl asked, surprised and upset. "To the capital," Alejandro replied, adjusting his glasses. "I'll be studying at the university there." Carolina felt very sad. She had gotten so used to Alejandro that she couldn't imagine life without him. "I'll write you letters," the boy said. And that's how they parted. Alejandro kept his promise. He wrote every month. Carolina was very interested in reading about his life in the capital, about his studies at the university. From that moment on, she had a dream of her own. The girl firmly decided that she would apply to one of the universities in the capital when she finished school. Several years passed. All these years, Carolina studied hard. She liked literature the most and decided to apply to the philology faculty. She spent all her free time reading books until a new boy appeared in her class. His name was Bruno, and he was the best soccer player in the city. His family had recently moved to a new house near Carolina's school, so Bruno was transferred there. When he first entered the classroom, all the girls looked at him with admiration. Except for Carolina, she was busy reading another letter from Alejandro. Bruno looked around the classroom for empty seats and, noticing Carolina's desk, where she always sat alone, he headed towards her. The girl hid the letter when she heard an unfamiliar voice. "Hi, can I sit with you?" Bruno asked. Carolina nodded. "Sure," she said. The boy sat down and started taking textbooks and notebooks out of his backpack. Carolina noticed that all his covers were decorated with stickers of soccer balls, but she didn't say anything. She really wanted to finish reading Alejandro's letter. She had stopped at the most interesting part, where the boy was talking about defending his thesis at the university. But Carolina felt uncomfortable reading next to a stranger. She didn't want him nosing into her business. So, the girl hid the letter in her backpack and opened a book. "What are you reading?" Bruno immediately asked. I knew I wouldn't get any peace now, Carolina thought irritably. She silently showed the boy the cover. He read the title aloud. Treasure Island. "What's this book about?" Carolina didn't want to talk to him at all. She sighed and replied, "About adventures." "Wow, I love adventures," Bruno exclaimed. "I'm an adventurer by nature." Carolina just nodded in response. "And you?" the boy asked, looking into her eyes. "Not me," Carolina snapped and hid behind her book. Bruno quieted down, but within 5 minutes he tried to talk to Carolina again. Fortunately, the teacher arrived, and the lesson began. However, after classes, Bruno was waiting for Carolina at the exit. "Let me walk you home," he said. Carolina sighed. Why is he bothering me, she thought. "I'm going to the store first, not home," she said. "And then I want to walk in the park. Alone." She emphasized the last word with particular expressiveness. However, Bruno didn't seem to notice. "Then it's even better, I can keep you company." "It's boring to be alone," the boy cheerfully declared. Not for me, Carolina thought to herself, but she didn't say anything out loud. She quickly tried to come up with another excuse, but she didn't have time. Bruno had already grabbed her backpack and opened the door, letting her through first. The girl had no choice but to leave the school. The boy followed her, took her by the arm as if they had known each other for 1,000 years, and led her down the alley to the school gates. "I'll show you my favorite store, where there's a cute cafe. My parents and I used to come to this area sometimes, and I grew to love it. I'm so glad I live here now." Carolina nodded silently. She longed for Alejandro's letter, which was lying in her backpack. She had planned to finish reading it in the park, but now everything was going differently than she had anticipated. "I'll have to wait until evening," Carolina thought to herself. She was not always a patient girl. Bruno chatted nonstop, talking about soccer, his family, their new house. Carolina didn't have a chance to say a word, but that was probably for the best. She didn't want to maintain this pointless conversation anyway. They walked through the shops, and Bruno treated Carolina to a chocolate pastry in the cafe. Then they went to the park, and the boy suggested they go on the swings. It was fun, and Carolina briefly distracted herself from her thoughts. Bruno walked her home afterward and tried to kiss her on the cheek goodbye, but Carolina skillfully dodged. At home, she finally finished reading the letter and wrote a reply. The next day, Bruno was waiting for her at the school entrance. He started talking again and didn't stop until the lessons began. After school, he invited Carolina for a walk, but she declined, citing a headache. So Bruno offered to walk her home. Carolina didn't know how to refuse him, but she really wanted to go to the post office and send Alejandro the letter. Since then, Bruno escorted Carolina home every day, and sometimes they walked in the park and went to cafes. The girl saw that the boy was interested in her, but she couldn't think of anything other than her studies and her future university entrance. 2 years passed this way. Bruno continued to take care of Carolina, and everyone considered them a couple. Other girls would have gladly been in her place, but Bruno only had eyes for his beloved. It upset him greatly that Carolina was planning to leave. The girl had long been accustomed to him, but she only had friendly feelings for Bruno. She didn't even admit to herself that she dreamed of seeing Alejandro again. They still wrote letters to each other. Finally, school ended. Carolina chose a beautiful dress for the graduation party, and right after it, she was supposed to leave the next morning. Bruno offered to pick her up so they could go to the party together, and Carolina agreed. The boy arrived in an elegant tuxedo with a bouquet of white roses in his hands. Carolina happily accepted the flowers and gave them to her mother, then took her purse and left the house. Bruno was talking about something again, while the girl inhaled the scents of the night flowers, looked at the stars, and thought about how she would be in the capital tomorrow. And maybe she would see Alejandro. He now seemed mysterious and unreachable to her. At the party, Bruno constantly invited Carolina to dance, and at the end of the evening, he asked her to go out onto the terrace. "I wanted to tell you something," the boy admitted when they leaned on the railing. "What?" Carolina asked, surprised, looking into his eyes. She thought Bruno's voice sounded solemn. "I love you," the young man said. Carolina didn't know what to say. Bruno leaned in to kiss her, but she pulled away. "Sorry, but I'm leaving tomorrow." "I know," Bruno replied. "But I can go with you." Carolina sighed. "Sorry, Bruno, but You're my best friend." The boy ruffled his hair with his hand. "So, just a friend," he said disappointedly. "Sorry," Carolina whispered. Bruno turned and left without saying another word. And early the next morning, Carolina left. She was very nervous when she arrived in the capital. Finding the apartment she had booked for the first time, she left her things there and went for a walk around the city. Of course, she knew Alejandro's address, and she planned to visit him in the evening when he returned from the university where he was now studying for his postgraduate degree. The capital enchanted Carolina, and she wanted even more to fulfill her dream and get into the university. Finally, evening came, and she, checking the map, headed to Alejandro's place. He lived in a dormitory for postgraduates, and the attendant at the entrance asked the girl to wait a bit. Carolina sat down on a couch in the hall, feeling her heart was about to jump out of her chest. Finally, she saw Alejandro. He was the same, wearing a checkered shirt with a bow tie and formal trousers. Alejandro smiled joyfully at Carolina, and as he came closer, he hugged her tightly. They went to a cafe because, as it turned out, both were hungry. Alejandro showed Carolina a cozy place right on campus where they could enjoy good food and conversation with soft music in the background. They talked about everything that had happened in the years they hadn't seen each other and couldn't stop talking. Of course, Carolina didn't mention Bruno. She didn't want Alejandro to feel jealous, but thinking of her friend, she involuntarily sighed sadly. Later, Alejandro walked her back to her apartment. The next day they met again. Alejandro had a day off. They walked around the city for a long time, and Alejandro showed Carolina beautiful places and landmarks she hadn't yet seen. Alejandro promised Carolina that he would help her prepare even better for her exams. "I'll ask to get you a pass to the university library," he said, and Carolina was very grateful to him for that. The young people's meetings became regular. Carolina studied hard for her exams, and Alejandro supported her as much as he could. The girl managed to get accepted, and she eagerly immersed herself in her studies. She and Alejandro saw each other almost every day. They walked, went to the movies, the theater, and cafes. Carolina fell madly in love with the young man, and he reciprocated her feelings. They dated for several years, and one day Alejandro proposed to her. It was very romantic. The young man invited her for a boat ride and unexpectedly gave her a ring right on the deck while she was admiring the sunset. Carolina was over the moon with happiness and, of course, said yes. A month later, the young couple had a wedding, which was very modest. Only the closest people attended the ceremony: the parents of the groom and bride, their siblings, and a few close friends. Carolina and Alejandro were very happy and left for their honeymoon right after the celebration. The honeymoon was simply wonderful, and soon Carolina found out she was expecting a baby. A boy was born who looked very much like his father. Fortunately, Carolina managed to get her diploma, but she couldn't find a job. Alejandro took on the responsibility of supporting the family. Of course, they lived very modestly because his university salary was not large, but the young man gave private lessons, and that helped their situation. Carolina and Alejandro lived in harmony, and within a year, the young wife became pregnant again. This time a girl was born. Carolina was very happy, although it was difficult for her with two small children. Fortunately, her mother often came to support her daughter. Alejandro continued to work hard and engage in his research, and Carolina hardly saw him. However, their feelings for each other did not fade. 2 years passed, and the young woman became pregnant again. This time it turned out she was expecting twins. Carolina was very surprised and delighted by this news, but it was difficult for her, and Alejandro supported her as best he could during this challenging period. It was not easy for him either. He had to work a lot and got very little sleep. When the twins were born, the house became very noisy, and Alejandro was constantly pale. Carolina spent all her time with the children, and the man had to cook his own food. But he was not at all suited to domestic life and often skipped meals. Carolina noticed that her husband had lost a lot of weight, but she herself was almost out of strength. Fortunately, by that time, her parents decided to move to the capital, and it became a bit easier for her because her mother was always around. Some more time passed, and Carolina began to notice that Alejandro was troubled by a cough at night. One day he woke up with a terrible headache, but a painkiller quickly helped him fall asleep again. The headaches became more frequent, and Alejandro's cough became increasingly severe. One day he left for the university, and closer to noon, the phone rang. The call came from an unknown number, and Carolina had a bad feeling. She quickly answered the call. "Is this Mrs. Garcia?" she heard an unfamiliar female voice. "Yes, it's me," answered an anxious Carolina. "This is the secretary from the department where your husband works," the woman continued. "Mr. Garcia fell ill during a lecture. He was taken to the hospital." Carolina felt nauseous and almost dropped the phone. "To which hospital?" she asked hoarsely. The secretary gave her the address in response. Carolina thanked the woman mechanically and hung up. She tried to stand up, but her strength left her. The children were out for a walk with their grandmother at that time. Carolina finally managed to stand up, put on the first dress and cardigan she found, and left the house. She went to the playground where the children usually played and, seeing her mother, informed her that she was leaving. "What happened?" the elderly woman asked, alarmed. "You look terrible." "Something is wrong with Alejandro," Carolina replied. "He's in the hospital." "I'm going to him." She called a taxi and went to her husband. She was shown to the room where Alejandro was lying. Her husband's face was very pale and almost lifeless. "What's wrong with him, doctor?" Carolina asked, on the verge of tears. The doctor looked at her with regret. "I feel very sorry for you, but your husband is seriously ill. Of course, we don't have all the test results yet, but I can tell you this now. This is not just a simple cold, and the case is very advanced. You should have seen a doctor earlier." Carolina looked at the doctor in despair. "But he worked a lot. We have 4 small children." Alejandro didn't think about himself at all. The doctor nodded. "I understand everything, and I'm just stating the facts. You can only hope for the best." Carolina burst into tears. She had sat by Alejandro's bed all day, but he hadn't regained consciousness. In the evening, the young woman went home to her children. The next morning she came back to the hospital, but her husband was still unconscious. This went on for more than a week. Carolina was already on the verge of despair when the doctor invited her to his office. He said that Alejandro had very little time left. "The problem is in his brain," the doctor said sadly. "It is too delicately organized. He shouldn't have overworked. Isn't there anything that can be done?" Carolina sobbed. The doctor shook his head. I'm very sorry. Most likely, he won't even regain consciousness. And so it happened. Alejandro died in his sleep. Losing her beloved husband, Carolina almost went mad with grief. Only the children helped her stay strong. The woman knew she had to be strong for them. After the funeral, Carolina suggested to her parents that they all return to their hometown together. There was nothing left for her in the capital. Everything is cheaper back home, and now we need to save on everything, Carolina reasoned. Besides, everything here reminds me of Alejandro. I can't live like this. Carolina's parents happily agreed. They didn't much like living in a big and noisy city. They packed their things and went home. Fortunately, they hadn't sold their old house. Carolina's sister, who was still unmarried, lived there. She was very happy to have the family back and prepared a delicious dinner for their arrival. Carolina almost cried when she entered the familiar house she knew since childhood. The smells, the sounds, the beloved objects and furniture, everything calmed her and gave her comfort. While the children played with her sister, the woman went to her bedroom and lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to imagine her new life without Alejandro. Tears flowed down her cheeks, and Carolina fell into a troubled sleep. She woke up half an hour later and at first couldn't understand where she was. Then the memories returned, and the girl started crying again. There was a soft knock at the door, and Carolina quickly wiped away her tears. She thought the children had come and didn't want them to see her in such a state. But it was her sister at the door. Carolina, dear, I managed to put the children to bed. They were very tired from the journey, she said, and noticing that Carolina had been crying, added, I don't want to disturb you. You need to get a good rest too. I'll be downstairs. Carolina hugged her sister and thanked her. As she descended the stairs, the young woman closed the door to her room and looked around. She didn't feel like sleeping anymore, and noticing the old books on the shelves, she decided to read something. She came closer and ran her finger along the spines of the books she had known since childhood. Carolina found Treasure Island, and her hand reached for it automatically. She remembered that day with unusual clarity. Bruno had joined their class and sat at her desk when she was reading a letter from Alejandro. Carolina had hidden it and opened this very book. The young woman sighed and climbed into bed with the book in her hands. Opening it to a random page, she read a few lines. The story captivated her again. Carolina started reading from the middle. When she turned another page, a yellowed envelope fell onto her lap. Carolina stared at it in amazement. She recognized Alejandro's round handwriting, and tears welled up in her eyes again. This was that very letter, Carolina realized. But how did it end up in the book? She must have forgotten that she put it there. A young woman took yellowed sheets of paper from the envelope, filled with the handwriting of her young husband, and began to read the letter. Carolina was overcome with sadness and nostalgia, and her heart ached with pain. By the time she finished reading the letter, she found herself crying again. Carolina was about to put the sheets back into the envelope when she noticed there was something else inside. She was surprised and, looking inside, pulled out a small cardboard card in the shape of a heart. Carolina took it in her hands and was astonished to see coordinates of some place written in Alejandro's handwriting, along with a phrase that made her heart flutter, "Go to this magical place and you won't regret it." Carolina could swear that the card wasn't in the envelope before. Or had she just missed it? Had the card been lying in the envelope unread all these years? Carolina bit her lower lip. She had to go there and find out what place Alejandro had written about, no matter what. The young woman stood up abruptly from the bed and left the room. Going downstairs, she found her father in the living room, watching TV. Carolina approached him and sat down next to him, handing him the card. "Do you know what this place is, Dad?" she asked. Her father muted the TV, put on his reading glasses, and peered at the coordinates on the heart-shaped card. "Obviously, it's somewhere not very far from here," her father said. "Can you take me there? Today?" Carolina asked excitedly. Her father took off his glasses and shook his head. "Sorry, dear, but I sold the car before moving to the capital. Didn't Mom tell you? We needed money to rent an apartment. Carolina nodded. Of course, Mom had told her, but she had completely forgotten. Her thoughts at the time were all occupied with the children. I see, Dad. Then I'll take a taxi. Her father nodded. Is it a friend's place? He asked, turning the TV sound back on. Carolina shook her head. I don't know yet, was all she said. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Carolina went to open it and couldn't believe her eyes when she saw who was standing on the doorstep. It was a tall, handsome man in a mint-colored polo shirt and light pants. Hello, Carolina, he said. Bruno, she exclaimed joyfully. He smiled sheepishly. I heard you came back to town and wanted to see you. So quickly? Carolina's eyebrows shot up. You know how fast news spreads in our little town. Carolina smirked. True. Bruno smiled again. May I come in? He asked. Carolina shook her head. Bruno, sorry, but I'm about to leave. Already, the young man was surprised. You just arrived. Or is your husband waiting for you? Carolina lowered her head. He passed away. Didn't anyone tell you? She asked bitterly. Bruno paled. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Carolina nodded. It's okay, she whispered. Bruno was silent for a moment. So, where are you going? Maybe I can give you a ride? I have a car. With these words, he nodded toward the Jeep parked nearby. Carolina hesitated for a moment. I'd be very grateful, she finally decided. Bruno nodded. Are you ready? He asked, glancing at her briefly. Yes, Carolina replied. Just let me grab my purse. When the young woman came out of the house, Bruno led her to the car and opened the door for her. Where are we going? He asked, getting behind the wheel. Carolina handed him the heart-shaped card with the coordinates, her hand trembling. It's not far from the city, Bruno said thoughtfully. But I've never been there. Me neither, Carolina whispered with a sigh. Bruno started the car and drove onto the road. Carolina didn't know what to talk about, and the man didn't insist on a conversation. He turned on some soft music, and the car's interior was filled with the beautiful voices of retro singers. Carolina reminisced about the past as she watched how her hometown had changed. Every place was familiar to her, and almost everywhere she had been with Bruno. How has your life turned out? Carolina suddenly asked. Bruno shrugged without taking his eyes off the road. Like everyone else's. Finished school, went to the local college, got a job. Carolina tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. But why didn't you leave here? The town is so small. Didn't want to, Bruno replied briefly. He turned the music down and glanced quickly at Carolina. Do you still play football? She asked. I became a coach. I work at our school, Bruno admitted. Carolina smiled, picturing the man surrounded by a bunch of kids. Strangely enough, in the young woman's imagination, it looked very harmonious. I never thought you'd work with children, she said. Why? Bruno was surprised. You always seemed like a macho type, Carolina said. Seriously? Bruno raised an eyebrow. Carolina just nodded in response. They fell silent again for a long time. The car had already left the town, and now green fields stretched on both sides of the road, with mountains visible on the horizon. We have about 40 minutes left to drive, Bruno said, checking the map. At some point, the road changed, turning into a winding path. The car wound its way through the rocks and finally emerged at a lake nestled in a valley. Carolina leaned forward. The sight of the lake excited her. It was shaped like that very heart with the coordinates written on it. How beautiful! Carolina exclaimed, her heart aching at the thought that Alejandro couldn't see this. Yeah, Bruno nodded in response. Why didn't I know about this place? I've lived here all my life. Yes, it's very strange. I've never been here either, Carolina confirmed. They slowly descended to the lake, and when the good road ended, Bruno turned off the engine and suggested they walk the rest of the way. Carolina nodded and got out of the car. She inhaled the cool mountain air mixed with the scents of various flowers with pleasure. Bruno offered his hand, and they began to carefully descend. The lake beckoned them with its turquoise coolness and purity. I've never seen anything like it, Carolina said, and Bruno agreed with her. It's a real miracle, he whispered. They descended and approached the very edge of the water. Carolina crouched down and touched the water. It pleasantly cooled her fingers. Bruno slowly wandered along the shore, then stopped by a stone. Carolina, look, here's your name, he exclaimed. The young woman stood up and walked over to him. On the stone he was pointing at, the word Carolina was indeed scratched, and the handwriting suddenly seemed very familiar to her. It's Alejandro. The woman gasped. He left my name here. With these words, she began to cry. So, many years ago, her husband had been here and thought of her. Bruno awkwardly hugged Carolina, trying to comfort her, but she kept crying, and it seemed to her that her tears would never end. When she had calmed down a bit, they stood by the shore for a long time. Carolina didn't want to leave this place. It really was magical, and she felt it comforting and healing her grief. The lake seemed ready to absorb all her tears and give hope for a bright and happy future. I must let go of Alejandro and say goodbye to him here, Carolina whispered. I feel his presence clearly here. Bruno nodded. I'll wait for you in the car, he said seriously, casting one more long look at the lake before turning and heading back to the Jeep. Carolina sighed. She approached the very edge of the water again and crouched down. For a long time, she touched the surface, letting the water gently caress her hand. Then Carolina took the heart with Alejandro's inscription out of her pocket and lowered it into the water. Forgive me, my dear, and goodbye. I love you and thank you for everything that was between us, she whispered. She thought she heard her husband's distant voice. It echoed in her heart and whispered words of love to her. I will never forget you, Alejandro, Carolina said. And even if I ever fall in love with someone else, you will still be in my memory and deep in my heart. With these words, the young woman stood up and, wiping away a tear from her cheek, smiled at the beautiful lake. Then she slowly walked to the car. Bruno, noticing her, got out of the car and opened the door for her. Carolina silently sat in the passenger seat and started crying again. Bruno said nothing. He perfectly understood the state of his companion. They listened to music the entire way back. When Bruno stopped the car in front of Carolina's house, she quietly thanked him for the ride. It was wonderful, she said. Bruno helped Carolina out of the car and walked her to the door. He could see that the young woman was completely drained from her emotions and tears. If you need support or any help, I'm always here, Bruno said, and Carolina nodded gratefully. Upon entering the house, she immediately saw her children with her sister. Where have you been, dear? Her sister asked in surprise. I thought you were resting in your room. I went to a place, Carolina replied and suddenly swayed. Her sister grew worried. You look so pale, she said. You need to go to bed right away. With these words, she helped Carolina upstairs. Carolina lay down in bed and immediately fell into a deep sleep. In her dream, she saw Alejandro. He was standing on the deck of a ship, and she was on the pier. Carolina tried to figure out how to get to her husband, but the gangway had already been raised. She shouted to him that she wanted to be with him, but he couldn't hear her. He just smiled silently and waved to her. Then Carolina screamed that she would wait for him, but Alejandro shook his head sadly. Please, don't wait for me, I won't come back, she heard his words. Be happy, my love. You have everything ahead of you. Carolina cried. The ship slowly sailed away from the shore, and Alejandro disappeared into the fog. The young woman wandered around the pier, wringing her hands, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, she felt someone's warm and gentle embrace. She felt that she could relax and trust them. Raising her head, Carolina saw Bruno's face. He was looking into her eyes with love and tenderness. At that very moment, Carolina woke up. Time passed slowly. Carolina engaged in her usual activities, playing with the children, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, walking in the park, shopping, and occasionally meeting old school friends in a cafe. She enjoyed this routine, which allowed her not to remember the past and not to think about the future. Bruno neither wrote nor called her, and Carolina was grateful for that. She wasn't ready to communicate with a man now, and using Bruno as a shoulder to cry on seemed unfair to her. Better let everything stay as it is, Carolina thought. And yet, she missed Bruno and often recalled her dream. So, Bruno never married anyone, she asked her sister. She shook her head. It seems he still loves you, her sister replied. Carolina only sighed in response. Several months passed. One day, Carolina was walking in the park with her children when she suddenly noticed a familiar Jeep. Bruno got out of it. Seeing Carolina, he waved to her. The young woman waved back. Bruno headed towards her. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and blue jeans, and Carolina suddenly realized how incredibly happy she was to see him. She felt something familiar and close in him, something she had been missing a lot. Bruno approached and greeted Carolina. Out for a walk? He asked. Yes, this is our favorite park. I was passing by, saw you, and decided to come over, Bruno admitted and, sighing, finished his sentence. To say goodbye. Carolina raised her eyebrows in surprise. Are you going somewhere? She asked, feeling her heart race. Bruno ruffled his hair with his hand. Yes, I've been offered a coaching position at a school in the capital. Wow! Carolina exclaimed. That's amazing. Yes, Bruno replied, but she didn't hear much excitement in his voice. You don't want to go? She asked. Bruno looked into her eyes. Not really. I love our city, he confessed. Then stay, Carolina said simply. Why do something you don't want to do? Bruno nodded and bit his lip. Sometimes I feel like I need a change of scenery. That's why I'm going. Carolina nodded. Can I write to you? Bruno asked unexpectedly. Carolina took a moment to find what to say. Yes, of course, she said after a minute of silence. Do you have some time? Maybe we can sit on a bench for a while. Bruno agreed. They sat down, but the conversation didn't flow. It felt like there was a wall between the young man and woman. Finally, Bruno was the first to break the silence. Carolina, you probably know that I fell in love with you at first sight back in school. Nothing has changed since then. Carolina couldn't believe her ears. Is that true? She whispered. Absolutely, Bruno replied. But even back then, your heart was already taken. Carolina sighed. And now, after your husband is gone, it would be too unworthy of me to seek your affection. That's why I'm leaving. I can't continue living here, knowing you're close by, but still not being able to be with you, hold your hand, hug you, wake up in the same bed. Carolina listened to Bruno's words, not knowing what to say in response. She perfectly understood his feelings and kept recalling her dream where he warmed her in his arms when her past was shrouded in fog. She desperately wanted to hug him now, but she couldn't move, as if she had turned into a stone statue. Maybe she was still subconsciously afraid of betraying her husband. Bruno looked into her eyes. That's why I only ask for permission to write to you sometimes. Maybe in the capital, I can finally leave everything in the past and move on. I know that for you, I am just a friend. Carolina silently looked at Bruno, not daring to break the silence, and he, not waiting for an answer, got up from the bench and walked away from the park. Carolina desperately wanted to catch up with him, stop him, and tell him how much he meant to her, but she didn't. She snapped out of her stupor only when she felt hot tears streaming down her cheeks. The children were tugging at her sleeves, complaining that they were hungry, and Carolina took them to a cafe. Another 6 months passed. Bruno wrote to Carolina, but very rarely. Sometimes he sent her beautiful photos of sunsets or flowers, as well as trophies that his team had won. But the young people never called each other. Deep down, Carolina thought that Bruno already had a girlfriend because she knew that many beautiful girls lived in the capital. It was hard for her to imagine them walking hand in hand through the city streets, and the young woman tried her best to distract herself from these thoughts. But at night, she dreamed of Bruno more and more often, and she missed him terribly. One morning, he sent her a photo of a heart-shaped lake at dawn. Carolina couldn't believe her eyes. "When did you take this photo?" she wrote to Bruno. The response came almost instantly. "This morning," the man replied. Carolina sat up in bed excitedly. "You returned?" she typed with difficulty because her hands were shaking. "Yes," Bruno answered. And a moment later, another message arrived, "And I want to see you." Carolina jumped out of bed and paced around the room in excitement. She was filled with joy and anticipation of happiness. "Me too," she wrote. In response, Bruno sent a smiling emoji. "I'll pick you up at 5, he typed. Carolina smiled and replied, "Okay." She rushed to the wardrobe and started going through her clothes. She wanted to dress up, but then she thought it wasn't necessary. She knew that Bruno accepted her as she was. Moreover, a doubt crept into her heart. What if this wasn't a date? Maybe Bruno just wanted to talk to her as a best friend? Perhaps he needed advice? Or help? So Carolina didn't prepare for the evening. She spent the whole day with the kids, and when the time came, she asked her mom to look after them and went upstairs. She put on a simple white dress with long sleeves and light sandals, parted her hair on the side, put on gold butterfly-shaped earrings, and smiled at her reflection. She looked natural and sweet. Carolina went downstairs at exactly 5 o'clock. Her sister, who had just returned, looked at her in surprise. "Are you going somewhere? Do you have a date?" she asked. "I don't know what it is," Carolina admitted. "Bruno just came back and wants to see me." "Wow," her sister exclaimed. "Then I wish you a pleasant evening." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Carolina opened it, and the first thing she saw was a huge bouquet of white roses. Bruno looked at her with love and admiration again. "I missed you so much," he admitted when they got into the car. "Me too," Carolina replied. He ran his hand through her hair. "I never could forget you," Bruno said inside. "And I realized that you are more than a friend to me," Carolina said unexpectedly to herself. Bruno couldn't believe his ears. Carolina pressed his hand to her cheek and felt the same warmth she had felt in her long-ago dream. Sometime later, the young couple got married, and Carolina realized that many happy moments awaited her in the future. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you.